And now on Book TV, a preview of Professor Wendy Lower's new book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields. Professor Lower, what's your book about?
It's about an entire generation of German women. I call them the World War I baby boomers. There was an increase right after the First World War, a spike in births, about 1918, 1919, and that coincided with German women getting the vote. So you have a surge of the kind of female population coinciding with the opening up of women's opportunities politically with the vote. So the story is about this generation that came of age during the period of the Nazi regime in the 30s, who saw opportunities that they didn't have before to be part of a political system, part of a revolution. It was all very exciting. Job opportunities, their first ways of getting out of their villages. Many of these women, were living in these very small, remote villages and wanted to get out and see the city and experience city life. So it's about these women who come of age with their ambitions and dreams, but these coincide with the establishment of a criminal genocidal regime. So what happens when that political awakening is also part of this horribly kind of political system that they come of age in, right? And I ended up tracing these women to the eastern territories of the Nazi regime where the crimes of the Holocaust occurred, the so-called bloodlands, the killing fields of the Holocaust. So we see how they kind of come in the German system, in Germany proper, and then they are mobilized to participate in these campaigns in eastern territories. And I had not read any books before that really placed women in large numbers in these sites, these crime scenes, and that's what my story is really about, is how they get to these crime scenes, how they react to what they see, how some of them move into the role of accomplices, and then the worst cases of those who move into killers. We often think of German female perpetrators as camp guards, and in small numbers, about 3,500 based on some very sparse documentation. But the reality is that this was a mass movement. German women were sent to the east to be part of Hitler's colonial imperial project. Part of it was called the War of Destruction, as nurses, imperial kind of developers, colonizers, in all different capacities. And they directly participated in this imperial project, which included the Holocaust, which included these genocidal programs. In understanding the magnitude of this, discovering the magnitude of this through the extensive research I've done, I wanted to make the book accessible to as many people as possible. It's grounded in a lot of research. I've been in this field for about 20 years, working in archives around the world. I went to Ukraine initially in 1992, which is where I discovered some of this material and started collecting these stories. And it just took all these years of going, to Yad Vashem in Israel, spending a lot of time at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and they have a fabulous collection there. Going to archives in Germany, going to collecting material from survivors in the U.S. So this massive collecting effort of stories to place these women in these killing fields, as it were, as these sites, and concluded that there were at least 500,000 women who were mobilized and sent east. This is new. Not only that we're putting them in the eastern territories, that my book is doing that, but in significant numbers and in a variety of roles. And that figure, 500,000, is obviously quite a contrast to when we think of female camp guards in closed camp settings, behind barbed wire, behind the walls, trained to be cruel. Now suddenly we've got a scene of women in all different kinds of capacities in these open air settings where mass shootings were occurring. Half the victims of the Holocaust died, approximately half in mass shootings, ghetto liquidations, forced marches, through famine, through starvation, and so forth. It became, in these settings, communities of violence started to develop, at these scenes that very much included women in these different roles. So I with this large number, right, I had to then kind of bring it down to individual faces, to put human faces on these perpetrators, since in the history books they're often very kind of demonized and presented as kind of freaks of nature or kind of sadistic figures, even pornographically so. And I wanted to present the reality, which is that these women, when they came of age, were people we could relate to. They were actually likable figures. And so the book kind of, you warm up to them in the beginning, and then you start to see how they're transformed by being moved to the East and confronting, witnessing this violence. And then we see, their different reactions, the spectrum of that behavior. This is really the main story of the book.
Were women supportive of the Nazi regime as it came to power in the early 30s?
They were, but they were involved in many different, this is this political awakening, political explosion of the interwar period. So they're involved in the communist movement, they're involved in a number of kind of folkish kind of people's movements, what would be right-wing movements, and moderate social democratic party, they were largely represented. So they were really, active in all.
Political spectrum.
Yeah, active in all these movements. And you cannot say, for instance, that women were responsible for voting Hitler into power. He was actually placed into the role of chancellor by a cabal, a kind of elites. But during the height, in 32, we look at the election results, July of 32, for instance, Hitler was made chancellor in January of 1933. We can see in certain regions where the Nazi Party was strongly represented in Germany, female kind of participation in that. And in participation in the movement as such, as aides, to the stormtroopers and so forth. But no, we couldn't predict, for instance, in 1933. Again, that's part of this kind of tension and the contingency that's so important in this history. That these women would go completely 100%, Nazi and rush off to the east and become killers. It's a process, a transformation that I'm trying to delineate through these biographies.
Wendy Lower, whose picture's on the front of this book?
That is Liesel Riedel, Wilhouse, her married name. It's a very chilling photo. Just the stare is it still grabs me, it still startles me. She was a young woman, again, a baby boomer, born right after First World War I, who grew up in a working class family in the Saarland, which was a contested territory, a border region where there was a lot of Nazi fanaticism, attempts to rejoin the Saarland. It was a League of Nations mandate with Germany in the 30s. She worked on a chicken farm. She had a kind of grammar school, grade school education. Again, trying to get out and see the world, these ambitions that are stirred by all the excitement of the interwar period for women in particular. And trying to find her way. And what she does is she finds her way to a Nazi newspaper office and is working as a kind of typist there because she has some clerical skills. And she meets her husband there, who is a real rabble-rouser, a real thug, a street fighter. I mean, he's showing off his scars and bruises to her, and she's somehow enchanted by that, by his brutality. And he's in the SS, and so he's got, a rising career. He's going to be part of the elite, and she attaches herself to him, and that's from her marriage application, the SS marriage application file. Their marriage had to be approved by Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer himself.
Because he was SS?
Yes, they all had to pass a kind of racial examination, very invasive for the women, gynecological examinations, very invasive examinations to pass the test of their racial not only their ancestry going back to the 18th century, but their biological features and so forth. So that's her front shot. The rest of the application has her profile and a full body image of her. Her husband is eventually made the camp commander of one of the most notorious sites in Ukraine, the biggest concentration camp in Ukraine called Yanalska, which was near Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov, western Ukraine. It was a site where hundreds of thousands of Jews were transit site were transported to Belzec and Sobibor, to these gassing centers, and many died in the camp as well as laborers. And they set up their villa outside the camp perimeter, and when she got there, Liesel said, well, I would like a balcony. I need a terrace, a balcony, and they brought Jewish slave laborers in, forced laborers, and they had to lay all the tile and make this nice for her. And what did she do with her daughter? 3-year-old daughter was also there. She brought the daughter, the whole family was there. Well, in this setting of this villa, sitting on the balcony where they would have their afternoon ritual of coffee and cake, she would pull out her Flaubert pistol, which was a kind of typical weapon, domesticated weapon bourgeois kind of parlor room. You know, you would shoot turn of the century Victorian parlor room. People would it was a recreation.